From the most densely populated to the region sprinkled with human life, the establishment of race as a social construct is found in every aspect of American life. America was founded on the slave labor that has created a social divide between people of different skin colors for centuries. The enslavement of people of African descent was created as a once thought permanent divide between the so-called lesser race and the people of European descent. In many people's minds, the concept of race is still instilled in their minds, and this shows through the racial tensions that we see throughout history, even after the dissolution of official Jim Crow laws. A few examples to think about would be the Trayvon Martin, Rodney King, and Colin Kaepernick incidents. These are all cases where African American men have been targeted as a minority group. Trayvon Martin was a 17-year-old African American man who was coming from a store in 2012 and was shot by a neighborhood watchman, George Zimmerman. Martin only had Skittles and an Arizona tea in his hands. Zimmerman was charged but was not found guilty for murder due to his claim that he was using self-defense. In the Rodney King incident, there were 4 officers that were involved in the beating. King was unarmed. However, according to the video of the beating, he was severely beaten, and only 2 of the officers were found guilty due to the excessive force. And the incident of this case led to the LA riots of 1992, when there was a final verdict from the court. In the incident of Colin Kaepernick, he took a knee to the national anthem before the 49ers football game. This caused a national outrage due to the lack of understanding for why he did this. His reasoning was that he did not believe in standing for a country where the government did not stand up for the minority. He was standing for a cause that needed attention, and it was not meant to disrespect the military, which was the original thought of those enraged.
Along with a few examples, there are also some statistics to think about. The FBI Uniform Crime Report shows statistics that reveal that African Americans account for 28% of all arrests, yet blacks make up only 13% of the American population. For example, the incarceration rate was 6.5 times higher for black males than white males, though the incarceration rate for black females was lower than that of African American men. It was still nearly 3 times higher than the arrest rate for white women. The Equal Justice Initiative investigation found that African Americans are arrested at rates 2.5 times higher than whites. Native Americans were arrested at 1.5 times at the rate for whites. African Americans and Latinos are about half as likely to make bail as whites. Latinos are twice as likely, and African Americans 87% more likely to be subject to pre-trial incarceration. African Americans and Latinos are less likely than whites to be sentenced to probation and more likely to be sentenced to prison. Black men are more than 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than white men. Native Americans are incarcerated at more than twice the rates of whites.
An example of legislation that impacted the Jim Crow era was the landmark case of Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, when Homer Plessy refused to sit in the train car designated for people of African American descent. These spaces, reserved for African Americans, were generally of poorer quality, thus making it difficult for someone to be comfortable for long periods of time while riding. Plessy argued that his constitutional rights were violated, but this claim was rejected by the Supreme Court, and they passed a law that stated, in their words, implies merely a legal distinction between blacks and whites. Following the case, public facilities between blacks and whites became very commonplace around the country and became a birthplace for the Jim Crow era. These public places of segregation were not considered unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of the United States. Another Supreme Court case that took place during the Jim Crow era that thankfully weakened segregation between white and African American communities was the case of Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. During this case, the Supreme Court of the United States unanimously voted that the idea of separate but equal education and other services were, in fact, not equal. This case was a cornerstone in the Jim Crow era and was one of the first cases that helped establish a step towards racial equality. However, the new laws towards people of African American descent weren't always so fair. After the Civil War, which determined the freedom of former slaves, former Southern states passed legislation that restricted freedom of African Americans. For example, they tried to restrict their rights by creating laws that would make it difficult for African Americans to vote. These laws were known as Black Codes. This long period, over 6 decades to be exact, was known as the Jim Crow era, where people of a racial minority were discriminated against due to ignorance and a lack of understanding. All levels and forms of government have taken notice of the Supreme Court's decision to allow legislation for a more equal society. However, in many southern states, racism still lives on in the community. Racism can present itself in many different forms, and a form of racism that we most commonly see today and among police is the act of racially profiling an individual and believing that they will act or present themselves a certain way based on stereotypes. Police, whose job is to protect us, also have played a role in the harming of its citizens. Saying that all police have a racist agenda is of course a generalized statement, because many good-hearted officers put their lives on the line to protect their citizens. Sadly, this is not always the case. Luckily, many forms of government are becoming aware of this issue, and justice reform has been happening around the country.
In order to delve deeper and better understand our topic, we decided to talk with some experts. We chose to speak with James Brown, the sheriff of Charlottesville, and Todd Niemeyer, the investigation specialist for the Human Rights Office. This is a portion of the interview with the sheriff.
Do you think there have been increases or decreases in the incarceration rates among African American men over the years?
Well, really, it depends on how far you want to go back. Under Bill Clinton, they actually had terminology with super predators, and I believe that's when 3 strikes and you're out came about. But there's some things that have gone on many, many years ago that have contributed to the disproportionate number of African American males incarcerated, and that's continued. It hasn't really changed much in decades, practically since some of those things have happened. But there are disproportionate numbers, and that, I mean, you can't argue with the numbers. It's you count people and you can look and see who they are. So I mean, it is disproportionate in regards to the population, the general population not incarcerated.
The interview with the sheriff left us with knowing that even he, an African-American sheriff, he has experienced racism and been a witness to it. He also explained his take on racism in America. This is a small portion of the interview with the Human Rights Office.
So have you noticed racial tension after the Charlottesville riots of last year?
I noticed it before and after. So,
But has it increased since that time?
Yeah, great question. So, I don't have like a lens onto how people are thinking unless they tell me, right? So, I have heard people tell me that, like, right after the riots, right? I talked to some folks about your age, high school students or just out of high school that I knew well and I've known for a long time, and we got to talking about the riots. And this is an African American male, like 18, 19, and he's like, I don't know who to trust anymore. People I used to think I could trust, now when I see a white person walking down the street, I think they're going to attack me, or I don't know what they're thinking about me. So that was a shift for him. So that's just one example. And if he's thinking that, I imagine that there are others that thought that, because that was a very scary situation for a lot of people, and a lot of people did get hurt and attacked. Obviously, like, if you go to like a city council meeting, like the tensions still run high in all the city council meetings. There's still lots of people that feel hurt and scared by what happened, and feel like that there was bias within the policing that day. I don't know if you how much you've read into all that stuff, but
we talked about
or if
that.
you've seen
Yeah.
videos of people walking up to officers who just shrug their shoulders when they say, "Hey, can you help this guy's getting beat up over here?" And the police are like, "Meh." And like, whoa, that's like, okay, what was going on in their minds? And then again, it's like, was that blatant racism, or was that like chain of command, bunch of complex stuff? They were limited in what they could do because of what their chief told them. Yeah, I don't know. Have you read the Hayfie report? Have you guys seen that big thing? It's the independent study. There was like they hired a law firm to like go through and analyze like the whole process of what happened on July 8th and August 12th. Tried to uncover like what were the major failures, and were they like, was it like a bunch of racist cops, or was it like systemic failures? And it's clear that there were systemic failures. Whether or not it's a bunch of racist cops, I think that's like, you have to dive into that individually. But I think it's more like systemic racism, things that are built into the system where, we just don't help situations like that because we don't know how. We don't have that capacity yet. So,
Mr. Niemeyer talked about the different investigations that he has dealt with revolving around racism, the racial tension in our area, and why some people shy away from the topic of race in general. The concept of race has always been around for hundreds of years. Yet, at this time, society seems to be a hot topic because younger generations are being instructed on the horrors of our past and are realizing the way we have mistreated our minority groups as well. This allows us to have an honest discussion about our past and helps us understand points of views from individuals who belong to minority groups. Also, with the access to technology, people are able to research on their own about different subjects such as race, instead of relying on their sole information from possible politically biased news outlets. As well as with being in an age of social media, we have been presented with media that shows we are all human beings and deserve equality.